Philippe, the curator at Sculpture Center. Thank you all for coming out and bearing the cold this evening to join us for our panel tonight, SE Conversations, Retracing the Expanded Field. We are really thrilled to host this panel discussion at Sculpture Center for a number of reasons, which might be obvious. As an institution dedicated to thinking about sculpture, this panel and this new publication is really exciting for us. So I'm very grateful for our moderators, Spyros Papapetros and Julian, who are the co-editors of the book we're discussing this evening, and for assembling this esteemed panel of artists/contributors, Josiah McElheny, Mary Miss, and Sarah Oppenheimer, who will discuss their contributions to the book this evening. And we actually have the publication on sale over there, and we have the exhibition catalog for the show on view at Sculpture Center on sale as well. And while I have your attention, I will also announce that in December, the weekend of the 12th, we'll do a 3-day screening at Anthology Film Archives, which is a program developed out of the research for the show on view at Sculpture Center, which I hope you saw, a little pothole portal. And so it'll include a screening of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, early Disney and Fleischer Studio cartoons, and other artist films. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderators, Spyros and Papapetros. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming. We thought in the beginning, me and Julian would give you something of the history of this project, how it came into being, and it actually took about 7 years. In the beginning it was a conference, a symposium in Princeton University, initiated between the School of Architecture and the Department of Art and Archaeology. And in fact, in the beginning we didn't think of doing something around Rosalind essay, but in fact the issue was to redefine what's the relationship between architecture and the visual arts that I think a lot of us are thinking. And so we came up with a number of terms that we keep using, like expansion, convergence, adjacency, projection, rapport, intersection. These are the terms that we usually might employ precisely to define architecture, which was our main, in fact, area or field, along or around other disciplines. And that's the moment we started rethinking about the expanded field and the essay, and decided to do something very concentrated and focused along a close reading of the essay, 30 years actually, about 30 years in 2007, now 38 after its publication in 1979. And so we came up with a series of questions, which actually I'm going to read from, and that was our introduction back in 2007, which has to do with the very legacy of the field 30 years later. The expanded field 30 years later. But what does it mean? What does one mean by later? No matter how many years may have passed, did not the field designate an area that would continue to expand? Expand, that is, while staying fixed within the limits of a geometric structure. And yet, is the expanded field not a set of operations that by its very definition only happens later or after? Its structures already crystallized before the field was mapped, it has the diagram retroactively delineating what has already happened. That's an issue that I think we should come back at the discussion that Rosalind's essay, in fact, maps conditions in sculpture that had already happened in the late 60s and 70s, so it has this retrospective aspect to it. And what about then about the term postmodernism that appears in Krauss's text, which will eventually reappear in the section towards postmodernism in her book, The Originality of the Avant-Garde and Other Modernist Myths, in which the expanded field essay would be republished. What happens when the towards postmodernism too becomes after, or yet another post, after the post? And when the term that toward once preceded is now part of the modernist mythology, it once vehemently countered. So we still leave those as questions that are still important, and we do believe that the critical operations by that essay do not really happen before or after, and that the field continues to retrace itself continuously as a result of the original procedures in which it was defined and has been in turn redefined by them. What we thought of doing in a matter of further introduction is precisely to show how this project developed from symposium to book. And there are some differences there. That is, we have kept the 3 round tables with transcription, not exactly as they were, the exact things that were said, they are edited. And so we had the first round table with Rosalind and her collaborators from October. Here they are, and discussion turned around the origins of the essay, its original condition. But it didn't stay at that. For example, we talked about the most seminal artworks at that point by Smithson, Lawrence Weiner, and others that were the point at that moment, late 60s and early 70s. But also it came to the discussion of architecture. The collaboration is a very uneasy one between architects and artists. For example, here Sarah with Eisenman. Second was the seminar table with 4 papers, and Julian will add it later. The reason we did that was because most of us have read that essay around the seminar table of a seminar, in university, college, etc. So the expanded field has expanded, in fact, through a space of instruction. And that interests us a lot, and in fact we wanted to sort of continue that sort of form of expansion with it. My essay deals with the field historiographically. I see it as a historiographic operation, or at some point a historian decides to make a grand gesture and map previous developments. And in fact, it looks back to the various versions of the history of the diagram. As we know, it comes from a diagram that traces sexual relations and within family. And then Rosalind, the very night of the conference, revealed that in fact she had taken that diagram from Frederick Jacobs' Political Unconscious and his analysis of Conrad's Lord Jim, which is a very interesting point because, as you can see in the diagram, basically what is mapped there, if that's the prehistory of the Klein diagram in the essay, are social relations, class relations within the platform of the ship. And the original field that surrounds that ship platform field is the sea, as Rosalind said. So the question is, how can you triangulate, or how can you even analyze a diagram, the body of water? And we thought it was quite interesting that if indeed the SAE marks the introduction of post-structuralism, the belated introduction of post-structuralism, in fact, in art history, then it does through these very sort of liquid type of body, like the sea. And a few years earlier on, Verdamisch had tried to do the same with the sky, for example. So we had 2 more seminar papers. Hart Foster, who is with us today, in fact, also has his take on Jameson's Political Unconscious, and then Eva Lane, not anything but diagrams, and then Julian.
Yeah, so my essay was more specifically addressing architecture's role in the essay in a way, and I was interested in kind of the antagonistic relationship that's always been seen between art and architecture, both literally in the knot of Krauss's terminology, and also I think sort of in the received association of work from that time, canonical works like Madaclark's Splitting or Smithson's Partially Buried Woodshed. And so what I tried to do through a series of case studies was show that in a sense both landscape and not architecture, the 2 terms which oppose architecture, were already essentially used to refer to architecture in the discourse of many artists at the time. So I was looking at people like Graham or LeWitt, and to argue that in a sense, architecture was already a very productive model for them at the time, but they weren't interested in engaging the discipline explicitly. So it was a way of sort of moving around architecture, but still deploying it. And then the next structure in both the conference and the book was a second panel discussion with, as you can see, George Baker, Brennan Joseph, Mi-Wan Kwan, and Stan Allen from Princeton. And here, as Spyros said, the first roundtable really focused on the history and the origins of the essay, and then this discussion was much more about the subsequent 30 years of practice, specifically kind of expanding the expanded field in various ways, both in terms of looking at the techniques and methodologies of the field itself and their role in subsequent practice, mapping, diagramming, notations, also looking at media rather than sculpture potentially as sort of a new frontier of interconnections between art and architecture, and then finally within architecture itself, looking at the role of design and the way that architecture's own cultural role has kind of expanded subsequently. And then the next section, which Spyros will discuss briefly, was what we're calling the documents section, where we collected a series of archival material about the book.
Well, we had to include the essay in some kind of form. We tried to find an original manuscript. It didn't exist, apparently. We went to the Getty, where the October archive is kept, but we learned it's one of the most mystic archives we can ever imagine. Everything, a lot of things seem not to be there. But the one thing that we did manage to find were some illustrations that were not used in the essay as it was first published in October. For example, this by Walter de Maria, and we found, the prints exactly with commissions, or this Alice icon, for example, that has a lovely description of the structure on the back. And these are, again, two images that were used. And in fact, the relation between text and image is very interesting in the text itself. Then another find was this small text by a catalog that not many people might remember from the first Architecture Biennale in Venice in 1980, which was about architects and artists' drawings about architecture. And Rosalind had published this small two-page essay on architects' drawings and artists' buildings. That was, remember, precisely the time when architects' drawings became actually commodities, and the first galleries like Max Proteg opened, and the storefront opened a few years later. So there was this movement of coming together on the level of drawing. So, and actually these are some of the drawings included in the exhibition, from Peter Eisenman to Mary Miss. And then we included part of the original catalog of Mary's installation that was one of the occasions for the essay to be published. So that's the original catalog that Mary very graciously allowed us to use. And finally, we see all these other structures that don't, other than the pit, that doesn't show up in Rosalind's essay. And in fact, most interesting are the series of photographs that Mary gave us of the construction of the pit here, which I think are the real things that we're most proud to have in the book as well, where it shows the intense physical labor that these things involve. So we have a chance to get down to the pit finally. Well, we don't in the essay, at least photographically. And finally, the final section is the one that we call responses, and we asked 20 people, I think 20, to respond A, to the essay, and B, to the proceedings of the conference that were not there in the original symposium. And there, we wanted to have a large range, a very wide range of both critics, scholars, established and emerging ones, and artists. So we started with Mary.
Yeah, so I'll just read it. We sort of sent this exact same questionnaire to all of the respondents, so I thought I would read the first paragraph just to give you a sense. When and at what stage in your own development, early education or later career, did you first encounter sculpture in the expanded field? Did you feel that the text had any particular resonance with your work, whether as a theorist, historian, architect, or visual artist at that time? And has it influenced your thought or the trajectory of your work since then? And this was because, in a way, as Spyros mentioned, I mean, a lot of us, I think, have had a kind of encounter with the text. Mine was certainly around a seminar table, as was Spyros's. And so we were sort of interested in getting that part of the response, but also in really seeing how people might have used the text in their own work. And something we found to be a kind of remarkable theme was, in a way, how compelling the structure of the diagram itself is, and how many people, whether artists here, Sandro Marpiero, an architect, to Joe Scanlon or Sam Durant famously, had sort of felt compelled to co-opt the diagram and make their own versions of it. And then there were other critics who had used it as a framework. Anthony Vidler gave us his architecture in the expanded field, for example. So in a way, that was one of the most interesting points to just see how pervasive it has become as a model. And with that, we'd like to turn it over to the three respondents who all very generously answered this questionnaire with their own thoughts.
Responding in a slightly different way, since I didn't meet this article at the table of a university, but after I had done this project, perimeters for millions decoys between 1979 and 80, or 78 and 79, I spent a year going out 5 days a week to Nassau County and kind of by hand building this underground structure. We did get a scoop to dig the hole out, but after that it was all kind of Egyptian style work. But I am going to reflect a little bit in this essay, which they've asked me to read, on what it was like, or where this came from at the time, from my point of view. The decade was almost over by the time art criticism and history knew what to do with the 1970s. There were so many things happening. There was no longer a singular line of inquiry, such as abstract expressionism or pop art or minimalism. And of course, it was a period of tremendous importance, not only for art, but also for architecture, landscape architecture, and so many fields. And so as a young artist then, I felt the notion of sculpture as a medium had already been fragmented so much that it did not really need to be challenged in itself. It was more the context in which art was being made and exhibited and talked about that needed to be confronted. The art world at that time was still very exclusionary, and although it was not often discussed enough, the women's movement was extremely important in expanding the range of art practice. We were not allowed in as participants, and so we were really interested in finding other ways of doing things. Sculpture in the expanded field was against pluralism, but I'm sure that many of us were really thinking mainly about taking things apart. Of course, women were not the only ones doing this, but for many in the art world, particularly women, during the late 60s and 70s, there was certainly a readiness to challenge how art was made, who made it, and what its role would be. With great optimism, we decided to rewrite the rules, change the boundaries, and deconstruct the existing framework. That's before deconstruction meant something else. It was a time of complexity, collaboration between disciplines and border crossings imposed. The use of imagery resurfaced, sexuality was addressed openly, and a multiplicity of voices began to be heard. We wanted to find ways to think differently about who looks at art, where they see it, how they experience it. I really loved your description of the sea around the diagram, and I think that's really the territory that we were exploring. We were just setting sail and without knowing what was going to happen. But I think this point that I've just made is really particularly important about the role that women had at the time. Because I think feminism and feminism so narrowly defined, and it's really time to kind of re-examine the effect of the activities of that period. For me, the creation of monoliths seemed an outmoded approach because it inherently sought to establish presence through a signature dominion. I was interested in making work that was integrated into its context rather than standing apart. I wanted to do projects that would change form as necessary to relate to a specific situation instead of coming up with a signature monogram. How might it be possible to foster a closer examination of one's surroundings? My central concerns were creating an elemental or essential experience of place and the means of engagement with the viewer, focusing on his or her experience. I saw ways of involving the individual in physical, visceral, or emotional ways. Setting up a situation that required movement from one part or place to another added the element of time. Building more and more projects in the landscape, I initiated a process of examining how the relationship between our built environment and the natural world could be reconfigured, redefined, or exposed. The project, Perimeters, Pavilions, Decoys, was important to me in this regard. I gave the exhibition that title because it was always about questioning your boundaries, about a kind of engagement with the whole site, moving from one part to the other, and not being able to see everything at once. My focus was always on an experiential, almost nonological approach to the work, which was also how Krauss was writing about sculpture at the time. I didn't know her personally, but of course I was aware of her work, and I invited her to visit the exhibition. In the pit that she describes, it's like you're walking under the skin of the earth. You come across this hole, and as you get to the edge of the solid ground, you've been walking across and realize that it's undermined. This is already a strange experience, but then you descend into the hole and walk under that skin into a corridor. And even in that corridor, you see openings in the back wall, and you're not able to tell where the undermining ends. For me, this was all a very compelling experience. And then later, after you climb back into the field and continue to explore it, you find yourself standing beside an 18-foot tall tower, not mentioned in the essay. You could climb up into it. There was a hole in the center, and from the tower you could see two others. Your immediate impression was that all the towers were identical, but when you walked the next one, you found it was only 15 feet high. And when you walked to the third, it was so small that you almost no longer could walk through the post holding it up. Perimeters, Pavilions, Decoys was about this whole variety of encounters and the way they began to weave themselves together across the landscape. I was thinking about the audience. It was important to me that people who knew nothing about art would come to this place and could viscerally, physically, emotionally engage with it. As a young artist, I don't think I would have said I was interested in architecture per se, but I was looking at the structures in the landscape, and I was really interested in how these structures fit in, whether they were oil refineries or warehouses, farm buildings, or any number of things. So from the beginning, I was really interested in this conjunction, or maybe collision, between the natural and the built environment. And there was a project that I did in Lower Manhattan in the early 80s, where I was kind of allowing the city and the river to meet each other. It's about a 3-acre project. It was a collaboration with an architect, Stan Eckstedt, and a landscape architect, Susan Child. This sense of collaboration became really important to the work. And here, in this particular project, I was actually able to take the city apart, where you see the beams on one side. There's a relieving platform, an engineering structure, which I've deconstructed, taken apart and flipped into the river. And you see here, before the buildings went up, the relationship of this place that I really imagined being an introduction to the water's edge for that density of downtown. In the next decade, there was another project in the middle of Des Moines, Iowa. This was the demonstration wetland that I built with a scientist from Iowa State University, a botanist, telling me exactly how this wetland could function again if we got it cleaned up. So I had a series of pavilions that you could walk to as you went around the site. One of my favorite spots was this recessed walk where you got to sit down at eye level with water. But one of the things that was really interesting to me is I heard this botanist tell me about how this wetland was working. I was really wishing that I could reveal more. I could give people these different experiences of walking, through reeds or getting up high and looking out at where the birds were nesting. But I wanted them to know more about this place in great detail. Another project that was done a couple more decades later was in Boulder, Colorado. And I have to say, during the decades of maybe the 80s and 90s, there were many large-scale, urban-scale projects that I worked on. Almost, every single time, the project would be eliminated before construction because it was an artwork. And the art was considered to be, the superfluous thing. So at a certain point in the mid-aughts, I decided I wanted to use very simple materials, take a very simple approach to trying to engage people with the landscape. So this was a project in Boulder, Colorado, where I put up 300 6-inch diameter dots, you could call them, that were marking the flood level of Boulder Creek. And it happens to be one of the highest flood zones in the highest hazard flood zones in the western United States. So these lines kept a perfectly constant level, but sometimes they were ankle high, like at the entrance to the library here, and at other times they were 18 feet up in the air. So as you walked this central area of Boulder, that line stayed constant, but you became aware of the land that you were crossing because of your relationship to it. But this abstract thing, which people had not at that time experienced, a serious flood in Boulder, became real because you could measure it in terms of your own body. So I've really become so interested in how these issues that are so important to us at this time, how artists can be engaged in communicating, how they can be engaged in making this accessible to people. So it's taken me into a whole line of work that has been extremely rewarding to me. It also really came out of my experience of living downtown at the time of the attack on the World Trade Center. And with my assistants after that, we decided to do a project we called the Wreath for Ground Zero. And it was meant to be a temporary project that would be up during the time that the reconstruction was happening. As I lived just a few blocks from downtown, from the site downtown, hundreds and thousands of people were coming to this edge, which kept getting smaller and smaller. But it consisted of a fence, of police barriers, and a lot of policemen. And I thought, what if you could replace this kind of barricade with other elements? What if you could make a place for people to be able to come as mourners, so that everybody who came could bring flowers and put them into these temporary dividers that we were making instead of the police barriers being replaced. But it really disturbed me that people were being forced into the position of being voyeurs. And so I was really interested in how that transition could be made by their actions, by their own actions, into them becoming participants. So as I'm talking about this, it's really describing a whole initiative that I've started, which is really intended to try and find a way for artists to be kind of recognized as having an essential role that they can play within the culture, to be a commenter on essential issues, not just the outside respondent. So I've started something. I've formed a nonprofit. I've formed something called the City as Living Laboratory, and I'm really interested in how to engage artists in kind of creating access to a different kind of city. So when you ask about the relationship to architecture that one could still have, it's really at the scale of the city now, whereas before I might have been looking at specific buildings or types of structures or how structures existed in the landscape. I really want to take on the city. So in taking on the city, I thought, how could we do this in New York? And I thought Broadway would be a good site. So there's this initiative called Broadway 1,000 Steps, where I've selected about 20 sites from the tip of Manhattan to the top of the Bronx. And this 18-mile corridor is a place that I would imagine being, having a series of these mirrors along it that could begin to decode different aspects of the environment. What's that storm sewer? You know, where does your water come from? Where does your trash go? I'm really interested, maybe obsessively so, in these details of the city. But what my vision really is that other artists and designers, over a period of time, would incrementally do a series of projects that transform the corridor of Broadway into a place where people can see a new idea about the city, or many new ideas about the city. One of the things we're doing is working with a game designer to figure out how we could get people to explore, want to explore the corridor. And we're calling this ludogeography, as kind of based on situationist theory, but taking it to be a way to get people to directly experience which way a drop of water would fall as it hits the ground. Let people think these things through on their own. And then we've engaged a number of artists to lead walks, to come up with different ideas of what could be happening, what could be shown. I think the thing that I would really like to do as a permanent work, is to paint all the roofs white along Broadway, so that this skunk stripe down the middle of the city would show a new kind of city, that we're not just the home of Wall Street or the 19th century New York that everybody knows so well. So I would just say that the undertakings, to finish up this little essay, the undertakings of those of us working during those earlier formative years helped to shift the course of our artistic practice and change what it means to be an artist or a visual thinker. We were interested in creating an expanded field of operations for ourselves that I'm not sure had anything to do with what Rosalind was writing about. And our efforts affected the way architects and landscape architects thought about their practice. For me, landscape or cityscape was no longer approached as a blank canvas waiting to receive the artist's mark, but rather became the location of a more intimate awareness and exploration of the site's history and the natural world. Collaboration and the crossing between disciplines became integral to contemporary artistic practice. We changed where and how art would be seen and redefined the role of the artist in the public domain. The artist took on the role of engaged citizen, not just the outside cultural commentator. The territory of artistic practice has been transformed by this entry into this expanded field.
by saying that I've been very interested in the history of architecture, especially as it's overlapped with politics and the dream of the way architecture could conceivably be about social relations and also how that connected with aesthetic ideas. And I think that maybe where that's come through in my work most strongly is I've been really interested in the idea actually of working in scale, so the idea of a model and the idea of a model made by an artist, not an architect, i.e. that it might not be viewed with the same kind of gravitas as an architect's model, and I viewed that, or I still view that as a positive, because I guess I'm most personally interested more in the idea of potentials rather than theories, and maybe if one could describe it as like the idea of as if X. I guess I don't I'm not very good at defining myself or describing a kind of coherent political practice. So in the end, my essay is really not about myself, but a kind of more direct response to the essay itself. And I tried to sort of think about how I try to discuss the question of sculpture with friends and colleagues and students. Artists today are often uninterested in categories like sculpture, painting, or photography, at least as they apply to themselves. It is not that they are dismissing the history of the various practices and traditions that are involved in each medium, in some cases just the opposite. Rather, artists are responding to the fact that these days, such categories provide them with little direction for how to conceive, produce, or exhibit their work. Why is this? I would suggest that it is perhaps because these distinctions, as they are traditionally defined, seem to ignore a vital question: where and how is the work of art seen? The critic or historian may find it useful to clarify an artwork by medium. Certainly it's easier, though not always easy, to describe a work as coming from one discipline or another after it has been exhibited. But to my mind, these definitions do not seem to offer much help to the artist in her studio, at her drawing board, or computer screen. For the artist, the boundaries that divide these categories are often more useful as something to push against. During the height of the modernist movement, it might have been possible for an artist to simply ignore the conditions in which his or her artwork would be viewed, and to definitely work within the predefined borders of a chosen discipline. But now, in particular for sculpture or installation, essential questions about how the artwork will be seen are inescapable. In fact, we expect artists to grapple with them. The type and method of display, its where and how, are all contingent issues that are deeply specific to the work at hand. These are unavoidable considerations for the artist, and they often determine how a sculpture functions in the most basic ways. Many seemingly autonomous monumental works, when they are pushed up against a wall, for instance, are no longer visually or experientially effective. It is important to note that these considerations are not just formal or practical. These decisions are what materialize the artwork itself. They tell the viewer how to look at a work, and they affect every aspect of its reception and interpretation. Sculpture is born of a similar process. Fundamental questions must be asked regardless of whether the finished work is intended as a statue of a general on a horse, a beautiful bauble on a plinth, or a site-specific installation. The artist's response to these conundrums is integrated into the very fiber of the sculpture, which is a quote from Alex Potts, who I think has really written really usefully on what sculpture is or how I perceive it. One overarching assumption can be made, however, that the situation in which the sculpture is exhibited will be temporary. Hopefully there will be a series of temporary situations, notwithstanding permanent installations. The artist's response to this condition creates a vast field of permutations, a myriad of possibilities. The artwork can be made as portable as possible, for example, or it can be in constant flux. Another example would be sculpture that intentionally disintegrates, or one in which the idea and the image of the work, rather than its materiality, is what endures. Unless the artwork takes the form of a proposal or thought experiment, the artist must take a stand on how it will exist with the single or multiple instances of its temporary display, its conditions of possibility, and by extension, how it will be viewed by others. Although it is impossible to plan for all contingencies, a work of art that incorporates the perspective of its viewer is very different from the artwork that forgoes any explicit consideration of its future in the public eye. To say that a work considers the viewer is not simply another way of saying that it is postmodernist, though that historical shift has made artists more aware of these issues and has led to new modes of contemporary sculptural practice. Arguably, even painting must engage in a dialogue about its site and situation, though for pictorial works or works that will be performed on a stage of some kind, these questions can perhaps be asked later in the process of their formation. Sculpture, though, must answer these questions about space and respond to temporal issues from the very outset. For instance, a sculpture must know very early on in its conceptualization or construction if it will sit on the floor, a decision that leads to a rush of seemingly quotidian issues. The artist must plan for the kind of spaces in which it can be shown, and for a host of other hypotheticals. Rosalind Krauss defined the expanded field of postmodern sculpture in her well-known essay, Sculpture in the Expanded Field, through oppositional categories like architecture and not architecture. Maybe this phrase can mean something else. The expanded field explored by artists since the 1960s could refer to an expanding engagement in the field in which an art is seen, maybe the ocean, as they were referring to. That is an expanding engagement in the field in which art is seen, that is the physical and conceptual space in which viewers observe and experience the work itself. This is not the same issue as the frame, because as artists are repeatedly demonstrating, the frame is a part of the artwork. The term monument and the idea of the independent object are central to Krauss's essay, which sets out to define sculpture's relationship to architecture and landscape. The idea of monument, or the theoretically independent object, is in many ways fundamentally opposed to these questions of time, space, and the viewer. A typical monument has a space reserved for it, its function is predetermined, and it offers a limited number of interpretations by those who view it. The monument must have a respectful amount of space around it, and it implies permanence. All of these aspects have been thoroughly questioned by developments in sculpture over the past 30 years, in which the viewer's interaction with the site and the inquisitive relationship with the substance of the object itself form the experience of the artwork. Lately, there's been a return to a mode of sculpture as object that functions like a monument or mini-monument, an object that pretends it can inhabit any space as long as it has a home in a corner or as a centerpiece for the room. This may be the result of the simple fact that in a world with an ever-increasing exchange of images, the representation of sculpture needs to be easily transmittable. A purposely discrete, freestanding object is easier to photograph. It may also be a reaction to the institutional nature and artistic limits of the spectacle, as seen in the boom of biennial exhibitions featuring large-scale theatrical works that require ambitious budgets, ample resources, and strong political support. Sculpture, though, remains different and important because it requires a site in which to experience it. It stubbornly refuses to accept the idea that experience can be readily distilled to the image, distributed easily, quickly, widely, and on a par with all other information. Although the ongoing revolution resulting in the decentralized dissemination of information breaks down some important barriers to the sharing of cultural questions and affinities, for instance, to my mind, it does not always help to promote the idea that knowing is a process, a never-finished process, and that we need to learn what we know ourselves. The way sculpture changes each time it is deployed, and the way it offers the most to us when viewed in person, are both its limits and its strength. Johanna Burton, writing about the definition of sculpture in Krauss's essay, humorously notes, "The old adage becomes solvable here. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, it absolutely would not make a sound. Simply put, you have to be there." Thank you.
As some kind of a site in and of itself, and actually as defining some sort of space. And sort of where I began in thinking this through. Imagine a section through the Klein diagram that describes Rosalind Krauss's expanded field. Confronting one method of representation and analysis, the structuralist diagram, with another, the architectural drawing, provides a radical shift in perspective. A laterally extending map is transformed into a line. One could see this line as a horizon. Alternatively, one could see the ground plane. In either case, assuming one cares to build upon it or dig beneath it, the line could serve as a datum against which to plot new forms of practice. This simple transposition of a field into a datum invokes the process of reducing the complexity of a site to a set of discrete and recognizable terms. This process is a method common to both architecture and many of the modes of expanded modes of sculptural practice mapped by Krauss, particularly the marked sites and site construction. When encountering a site, one is presented with innumerable variables: the material manifestations of the environment, the flows through these material contours, the fuzzy boundaries of a site's edges, the structural forces binding mass, the optical and oral properties of deflection, the social and economic forces that shaped the space and continue to animate the space once built, and so on. Architectural representation simultaneously erases some qualities of site while bringing others into sharp relief. Drawings such as plans, sections, and paraline projections are long-established strategies for working within and around the complexity of site. Though such strategies are often equally important in sculpture, they lack a parallel tradition. The sharing of representational techniques suggests a relationship between these two fields beyond the opposition diagrammed in the expanded field. In 33D, a recent project at Kunsthaus Basel in Switzerland, for example, architectural drawings were a starting point for the analysis of a built environment. Importantly, such drawings share some fundamental characteristics with the Klein diagram. Both are atemporal maps of an organizational logic. These drawings represent the spatial organization of a building in a manner that is at odds with the sequential reality of inhabitation. Adjacencies, sightlines, and circulation are temporarily collapsed into a simultaneous present, just as Krauss's diagram momentarily arrested and clarified the chaotic field of contemporary artistic practice. Today, drawing's atemporality is magnified by the unified materiality of a digital interface. Analog architectural representation is gated by the methods of its own production and revision. In 33D, analog drawings were used to chart how light levels impact the reflectivity of two large glass planes, subdividing the gallery into 4 quadrants. Paper drawings and physical models bear a material trace of design changes. When a viewpoint is moved in a paper drawing, for example, its motion can be traced through evidence of erasure or through the accumulation of drafts. In contrast, in a digital model, multiple iterations of a space's representation can coexist simultaneously. This digital model diagrams the viewing envelope from a single position within a bounded space. All zones blocked by material surfaces are excluded from the envelope. One can also think of this as the volume of a space illuminated by a point source of light. As the viewer moves, the geometry of the envelope changes. By viewing these iteratively, we can begin to analyze the vision volume of a moving body within a bounded space. Virtual viewing envelopes occupy overlapping positions within the coordinates of the model. Changes in viewpoint are associated with neither spatial nor temporal erasure, allowing us to rethink the possibilities of time-based inhabitation. This simultaneity of digital representation enlarges the scope of iterative design. Time-based variables such as daylight and precession can be studied as recursively generative, both determined by and determining of the digital model. A multiplicity of moments is viewed simultaneously. Manifold futures can thus be projected a priori into the present tense of a digital architectural drawing. In developing 33D, parametric code was used to iteratively model the visual envelope of a moving viewer through different possible architectural layouts. In this isometric drawing of the exhibition space, two walls, indicated by double lines, are inserted at 45 degrees to the room's primary axes. Two large planes of glass, here represented by thicker dark lines, create passable thresholds between the subdivided galleries. The parametric code analyzed how the reflectivity of the glass changed as the occupant traversed different viewing positions. The script modified the viewing envelope to account for the relationship between changing light levels and material transparency. The geometry generated by this analysis was embedded within architectural drawings, determining the final relationship between sightlines and the two large glass planes. Feedback between analog and digital models resulted in the final configuration of the work. The following are images of the completed piece from various viewing points. Upon entering the space, the sightlines pass through the darkened face of one large glass plane. And reflect off the illuminated surface of a second glass plane. From the central space, the viewer faces the illuminated surface of both planes of glass, transforming the glass into a mirrored surface. From the far end of the space, sightlines invert, reflecting off the originally transparent plane to the building exterior. When the exterior light levels change, reflective surfaces become transparent, and the previously transparent surfaces become reflective. In a sense, the generative possibility of the atemporal model was already operative in the expanded field. Krauss's diagrammatic schema represented a multiplicity of positions simultaneously, within which architecture and landscape implied the specificity of site. And yet architecture is only partially comprised of the specificity of the built environment. Architecture is also the unrooted, hovering field of diagrammatic representation. Embedding this field within the productive processes of sculpture blurs the assumed site specificity of architectural practice. Simultaneously, the richness of architectural representation pulls at the edges of sculpture, contaminating it with the qualities of those sites in which it operates.
So I think, we chose you three because we thought you were so relevant to the essay, but also quite different with each other. And we were, in fact, intrigued by the differences. And in fact, by some of the differences that came up today with your presentations. In fact, the questions that we would have would be precisely about your own attitudes, relationships, A, to architecture, B, to sculpture, and 3, something that became quite obvious in the presentation by Mary, but also in both of you, the space of the city, and where do things happen. That is, how can we redefine the field, basically? Because one of the major questions that was, both in the 60s and then around the period that Rosalind wrote the essay, was precisely what can the artist do to get out of the gallery or the space of the museum museum. So the question of the field is not a merely conceptual one, but in fact it engages the actual space of action. So could we perhaps start with that? First of all, the relationship with architecture. You just said, for example, you're interested in the history of architecture in terms of an inherited language of images, because some of the architecture you're dealing with is extremely iconic. You, Sarah, it's mostly a series of more conceptual diagrammatic processes, right, that might, in fact, even though your own work has a lot to do with actual space. In fact, I like very much that in that particular installation you can actually see what is outside the space of the gallery, right? So it's not as if the city is totally cut off. And obviously, Mary, in fact, when we had talked to you, we noticed that your earlier structures seem to play more in nature and trying to bring architecture within nature. But lately, in the last decades, you have come closer and closer to the urban real. And it seems that acting on the city is important. So perhaps start this way, or the middle.
I just want to respond to that because I think something that for me was extremely interesting about the original essay and also interesting in terms of reading people's responses and comments was that architecture actually is such a blurry term. And so I think something that I'm very excited about is both its blurriness but also its specificity. And I think that that's perhaps an interesting place to begin. Not sure that.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the essay, it seemed that sculpture was the problem, right? That it had become something that it could mean anything. On the one hand, it was sort of marginalized. It was this thing that you bump against when you back up to see a painting, according to Barnett Newman. But I think in the book, architecture has also become a problem, right? Or the thing to be problematized.
Mary, especially your shift from sort of the building to the city, I think would be interesting.
Well, I think exploration has always been the thing that's really interested me. Exploring a place, a site, a city, and exploration implies action, activity, and I think the thing that I was kind of puzzled by is I don't believe that after that essay was written that there was really ever a recognition of that ability of artists to be in a position of taking action. And you know, it's like it almost set that out, but then it was never followed through. And I was kind of shocked that when things went back to being always the thing that could be, the photograph could be taken out, when there were all of these possibilities. So that's the thing that really interests me, is my ability to take action, the viewer's ability to be activated. In that old project, Remembrance Pavilions, it was that you got to walk around the whole field. So it was kind of missing the point to only have it in the pit, but how could you explore that whole space and you know, make what you would of it? So action, the ability to act is the thing that's led me in the direction that I've gone, I think, in terms of how I'm thinking about the viewers, how I really would like to be able to catch people on the street with these mirrors. I put them on the street thinking that, you know, New Yorkers are really quick to spot the latest sneaker, you know, the latest hairstyle, that they could take that moment and could you catch them in that moment with this bright thing out there, and allow them to build for themselves a new map of the city or of their neighborhood. So I love this idea of getting on the street of the city and activating it.
Well, I like this word action that keeps coming up, and the idea that maybe the field is, the field is people, or that art is what that action is what happens around the artwork. And just a comment on what you all were saying. For me, my personal interest in architecture is just that, harkening back to maybe, let's say, the Russian artists of the right after World War I. I mean, at that time, maybe artists were really, truly thinking big. You had, artists designing sportswear, for example, in 1924 in Russia. But in general, it's not that easy to think big as an artist. And I'm also, knowing a little bit about history in the 20th century, pretty scared of people who think big. So for me, what's interesting about architecture is that, and in the whole tradition of paper architecture, it represents the potential of thinking big without being big.
I just want to say, I think that there's a whole series of processes that accompany what might be considered action or exploration or the built environment more generally, which has to do with its construction and its kind of translation from the diagrammatic space of representation to its actual inhabitable urban location. And that in some sense, that process is raced through the two terms on the table. And I think it's an interesting erasure that's happening, so that you have the kind of paper architecture, or the space of the diagram, or the space of the manifestation, where you have the action exploration of the built world. And there's no space between those two poles to think about a space of work. And I think that is a very interesting place of work.
What is that space? What do you mean?
I mean, I think that in the processes of moving from a kind of diagrammatic space, or a digital or paper space, a model, to the world, there are all sorts of material, social, economic interactions, that mechanized interactions, non-mechanized interactions, legal interactions, that are spaces of work, such as how does this microphone go from a kind of CAD file to being here. That is a really interesting transformation that I think gets erased if we only think about it as something we're interacting with, or it as a drawing.
Does that have something to do with power?
I think it has to do with how we imagine a field of operations, actually. I think everything has to do with power, but I think the drawings and the inhabitation have to do with power. But I think that if we're talking about what does it mean for our work as people who make things or propose to make things, or however we want to define that, where is that located? Is that in the space of action, exploration? Is it in the paper architecture, or in the proposal or model space? I think there's also this space between those things that is a whole field of operation that's really interesting.
I'd just like to follow up on, by maybe pushing on the idea of representation a little bit more, because one thing that has sort of fascinated me both tonight and then also even looking at all the responses in the book is that representation has emerged as such a key term, even though I think maybe within our discourses it's less important than it has been in recent years. But it seems like that's actually one primary point of intersection, that artists have used representational techniques from architecture in certain ways. You all did, Sarah and Josiah sort of explicitly, and Mary, you're showing us renderings that in a way are, I don't know if they're made by interns who are trained by architects, but they're sort of reminiscent of things that an architect would use to present their ideas. And, to then the question becomes how the three of you, maybe in different ways, see representation operating within your practice, because certainly in architecture, representation has always, in a way, been more than representation. It's been a space of translation specifically. So Sarah, to get to your point, I mean, in a way that's, I think, the kind of ideal of the architectural drawing, that it's not just the paper architecture, it's actually the step when the abstraction of the idea, or maybe the diagram, sort of takes root into the building, and it's actually the mediator between the two, potentially. And I don't know if that's a model that, you know, actually works in practice, or if that's kind of more of a specifically architectural thing, but I'd be interested to hear.
I guess I'm confused by the word representation, because, I think we're all trying to represent things, we're trying to assemble things that can be legible. So all artistic presentation is, to me, in some fundamental way representational. And I guess that, to follow up on what you were saying about saying paper, I guess that's why I brought up the idea of maybe the field or the ocean, as you describe it. It's the people, and it's the action of the people. So my interest is that if you draw something on paper and it's on the wall and somebody sees it, or somebody gets sent it in a book or sees it on a computer screen, like, what happens? And that's the action, that's where the action is, to me. It's like or at least the potential is that things happen afterwards. And if the stereotypical idea of an architect is to build a building, well, I think maybe the artist's idea is to get people to talk a different way, or see something slightly different and add to their vocabulary. Like it's a social action that, at least me, that's what I'm hoping for. Maybe that was off topic, I don't know.
Well, I would just, my last image was the kind of height of representation. We like this anecdote that someone approached a friend of mine, and she said she worked with me, and the person said, "Oh, Mary's the one who painted all the roofs white on Broadway." And I thought, yes. It's so much easier to show that as an image than to actually try and get permission to do it. There's that ability to convey a kind of wild idea that otherwise is probably impossible to have happen. But I actually, when I think of representation, I love to look at drawings, master drawings, or any kind of drawings, where there's the kind of beginning of thinking, beginning of thought. I think it's, that's one of the most exciting things to me, is to see drawings, that immediate hand paper. And it's not necessarily representations I'm talking about, but that kind of immediate discovery of something.
For example, Josiah, for you, the model is important. At some point, it even becomes an object, it's a sculptural object. For an architect, the model is a medium that points to another object, which is the building. Sometimes, though, we know in the history of architecture, models have become the object. In fact, become much more powerful than the building. Like the niche model that you have turned into one of your works. So that would interest me as well. And we said that the 1980s was the moment where the drawing was kind of objectified as the thing that you put on the wall as a finished object. Maybe that's either for architects or for artists as well. So it's that moment where you're using a medium like the model, like the drawing, like the one-to-one structures that you were doing. How much do they become, perhaps what Sarah was mentioning earlier, that there are several stages or degrees that each of these mediums can have an activist role beyond the drawing table, right? So these kinds of extensions of each medium, drawing, model, structure, physical structure.
I think think that's a really interesting point, and I think your reference to, and your discussion of putting a drawing on the wall and its legibility is also a really interesting question, because I'm often struck by what it means for something to be legible and how we have control, either we have control or we cannot control legibility, and that if you make a model that is, in some ways there's an issue of intent, which I don't really want to get into, but let's say a model is legible as a stand-in or pointing to some kind of other thing, like a building, but it could also be pointing to some kind of other thing, like a history of ideas, right, in the case of a number of projects that you've worked on. And I think in some sense, there's a decision there of what history you're choosing to engage in modeling. So are you modeling a kind of synchronic moment where you're building a chain reaction, a set of, let's say, fabrication or material translations, or are you modeling a kind of legible or illegible historical aesthetic field? And those seem related and sometimes combined, but actually relatively different in terms of how they operate, to me.
I don't think I'm smart enough to determine those factors within my own work. I mean that seriously. When you start talking about the controlling legibility, I feel like a total failure at that, in the sense of what my intentions are and what I intend to be legible or read is often so every time not what happens. So I think in my case, my gestures are at a very basic level are very childlike. For example, like you see somebody make something or propose something or build something with a certain kind of attitude in mind, and you think, well, could it be different? And so it's